Behind the glass doors of the private hospital's emergency wing, machines were still flashing, nurses were still rushing, and the afternoon sunlight was pouring through the tall windows, but everyone in the room had already accepted what they believed was inevitable. On the examination table lay 6-year-old Kairo Whitmore, the only son of one of the richest men in the country. His tiny body was frighteningly still, his breathing barely noticeable, while a team of specialists stood around him with exhausted faces. His billionaire father, Alastair Whitmore, had spent millions on the best medical care money could buy, yet none of it had been enough. Then, when everyone else stepped back, a black single father named Malachi Brooks, wearing a worn brown work vest and carrying his own little daughter, walked into the room, and noticed something the doctors had missed. If you believe kindness can save lives, that second chances can appear in the most unexpected places, and that we should never judge a person by their clothes or circumstances, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Heartline Stories for more emotional stories like this. It had been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Malachi Brooks entered the hospital. He was 38 years old, a widowed father who worked maintenance jobs wherever he could find them. His hands were rough from years of repairing broken pipes, fixing electrical systems, and doing the work most wealthy people never noticed. He had arrived at the hospital carrying his 5-year-old daughter, Nia, because she had slipped while playing at school and cut her forehead. It was supposed to be a quick visit before they went home. Malachi had no idea that within minutes, his life would collide with the world of a billionaire. Across the emergency room, Kairo Whitmore had suddenly collapsed while visiting his father's corporate headquarters. His family had rushed him to the hospital, where specialists performed test after test. His heart was beating irregularly, his oxygen levels were falling, and his body was becoming dangerously cold despite the warm room. The doctors tried medications, oxygen, injections, and emergency procedures. Nothing worked for long. Alastair stood outside the treatment area wearing an expensive gray suit, staring through the glass with the helpless expression of a father who had built an empire but could not save his own child. By late afternoon, the hospital had become strangely quiet around Kairo's room. Nurses whispered instead of speaking normally. One doctor removed his glasses and rubbed his exhausted eyes. Another quietly told Alastair that they had reached the limit of what modern emergency treatment could offer at that moment. The words shattered him. Alastair had always believed that money could solve almost anything. If a company failed, he bought another. If a building needed repairs, he rebuilt it. If a competitor threatened him, he outworked them. But now his son was lying unconscious, and there was nothing his billions could purchase. Malachi happened to be walking past the room when he heard a strange sound. It was not the monitor. It was not a nurse. It was a faint clicking noise coming from beneath Kairo's hospital blanket. Malachi stopped. His daughter was resting against his shoulder, and he looked through the glass. Something about the child's position bothered him. Malachi had spent years working around machinery, water systems, electrical panels, and emergency equipment. He knew that when something suddenly behaved differently, the smallest unusual detail could reveal the problem. He quietly approached one of the nurses and pointed toward the boy. The nurse initially dismissed him, explaining that the child was under the care of specialists. Malachi did not argue. Instead, he watched. He noticed that Kairo's fingers were slightly blue, but his face was unusually flushed. He noticed the boy's chest moving strangely and remembered something from years earlier, something he had learned while working as a volunteer emergency responder before life forced him into full-time labor. Certain environmental exposures could mimic serious internal illnesses, and sometimes the first symptoms appeared deceptively similar to heart or neurological failure. Malachi looked toward the kitchen area at the end of the corridor. He suddenly remembered smelling a sharp chemical odor when he entered the hospital. The maintenance worker inside him became alert. He asked whether the boy had been exposed to any cleaning chemicals or industrial equipment before collapsing. The question finally caught the attention of a physician. They checked Kairo's belongings and discovered that earlier that afternoon, the boy had been inside a newly renovated executive conference room where strong chemical cleaning agents had been used. A portable ventilation system had malfunctioned, trapping fumes inside the room. The doctors immediately began testing for toxic exposure. Within minutes, the entire atmosphere changed. They discovered that Kairo had suffered a severe reaction to chemical fumes, which had triggered dangerous breathing and circulation problems. The medical team began emergency treatment based on the new information. Oxygen levels slowly began rising. His heartbeat stabilized. Then, after what felt like an eternity, one of Kairo's fingers moved. Alistair stared through the glass in disbelief. The billionaire father who had been prepared to say goodbye watched his son open his eyes. Malachi did not celebrate. He simply looked down at Nia, kissed her forehead, and prepared to leave. He believed he had only done what any decent person should do when they saw a child in danger. But Alistair followed him into the hallway. For the first time that day, the billionaire looked at the poor maintenance worker not as a stranger, not as someone beneath him, but as the man who had helped save his son. What Alistair did not know was that Malachi had spent his entire life learning how to survive without anyone coming to save him. After his wife died suddenly 3 years earlier, he had been left alone to raise Nia. There were nights when he counted coins before buying groceries. There were mornings when he went to work exhausted because his daughter had been sick all night. Yet despite his struggles, Malachi had never allowed hardship to make him cruel. He believed that if you could help someone, you helped them. You did not ask what they owned. You did not ask what color their skin was. You simply helped. The following morning, sunlight poured across the hospital windows as Kairo sat awake in his bed, weak but smiling. Malachi was there with Nia, expecting nothing. Kairo reached toward him with a small hand, and Malachi gently took it. Alistair stood nearby with tears in his eyes, realizing that the greatest lesson his son had received that day had nothing to do with wealth, medicine, or business. It was about humanity. Alistair offered Malachi money, a house, and a position in his company, but Malachi initially refused everything. He only asked that the hospital create an emergency training program for parents and workers so ordinary people could recognize dangerous environmental symptoms before it was too late. Alistair agreed. What began as one man's desperate act of kindness eventually became a foundation that trained thousands of families and workers across the city. Months later, Kairo returned to school completely healthy. Every Tuesday afternoon, he visited Malachi and Nia. The billionaire's son and the maintenance worker's daughter became inseparable friends, proving that the walls people build around wealth, status, and appearance can disappear when compassion enters the room. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Heartline Stories. Sometimes the person we overlook may be carrying the very help we desperately need. Special request: before you leave, comment, "Kindness has no color," if you believe every human being deserves compassion, no matter their wealth, background, or appearance. Because that afternoon, a billionaire learned something money could never teach him: sometimes the greatest miracle does not come wearing a white coat. Sometimes it arrives in worn-out clothes, carrying a child, with tired hands and a heart that simply refuses to walk away.